Hey guys, summer school again. Today we are talking Northwestern. That's Bradley Locker inside in you. Also Bradley underscore Locker. We don't have a 24/7 Sports Northwestern site. Going back to my old haunts from the SB Nation days. Welcome to the show, man.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me here, bud. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So Northwestern is a team that I can't say I've been high on, but I have been fascinated by over the last couple of years. I know on the show we frequently debate like how much do you count the COVID year of 2020 for various purposes, whether it's assigning blame or credit, or even for any kind of modeling if you want to get really nerdy with it. And Northwestern's a ball club that has won a single Big Ten game in 2019, 21, and 22, and they just were amazing in 2020. You're there covering it. Just off jump, do you think this year will feel different than last year?
It's really tough to say. I think the energy has been a little different in terms of practices, and we actually are not allowed to watch practice at Northwestern for the vast majority of the time. So, in the very limited snippets of practice that I've seen and in talking to coaches and players in spring ball, there definitely is a sense of turnover in the sense that Northwestern has 5 of its new coaches on the staff are just brand new from different programs. And I think that's not an accident that Pat Fitzgerald recognized that he had to go out and make some changes. He changed some longtime assistants like Dennis Springer, like Marty Long on the defensive line, and bring in guys who maybe haven't been at that Power 5 level, but that have definitely produced talent and have had winning success at other FCS levels. Like David Braun from North Dakota State led the Bison to 2 national titles, and I think that's not an accident. It's definitely some intentional moves, and I guess it's tough to ascertain whether or not that's from outside pressure from someone like athletic director Derek Gragg, but I do think that Northwestern understands there is a bit of sense of urgency this year, but we did hear kind of similar messaging from the Wildcats before last year that 2021 was not going to happen again, and then 2022 is far more cataclysmic. So it's still way too early to say, but I think Northwestern is hoping that it did enough to kind of tread water, and then the new coaching staff will really be instrumental in hoping to turn things around and maximize the talent on the roster.
That's crazy to me that Northwestern has such a good journalism program, and the football program doesn't allow people to go watch practice. Like, who is trying to spy on Northwestern practice? That's okay. Offense last year, pretty disappointing. I know my friend Bill Connolly had him 109th in the country in SP Plus. There are some interesting pieces who return. Quarterback, though, I think obviously Ben Bryant going out from getting the guy from Cincinnati. There's a 100% chance he starts, I assume, right?
I would say I don't know if that's 100%, quite frankly. And just looking
Okay.
at Brian's tape, I think he's entering his 6th year of college football. He's only been a starter for 2, but I think it would surprise the vast majority of people if he doesn't start, just because again he decided to come back for his 6th year to leave an upstart Cincinnati program that yes did lose its head coach in Luke Fickell, but probably would have been assured the starting job with the Bearcats. And he's an Illinois native. It makes sense. It's kind of a feel good homecoming story to lead the Wildcats back to glory is certainly what he's hoping to do. But yeah, and just kind of watching his tape, I think there were some flaws in the areas that needed to be cleaned up a little bit. And I think Brendan Sullivan, who kind of emerged as the starter last year, only going to be entering his 3rd season, I guess, of being on the team. I believe he will be a redshirt sophomore this year. But I think with Sullivan, he kind of unlocks more facets of the playbook with his athleticism and mobility. Didn't see that as much with Brian, but I would say probably a 75% chance Brian starts, but obviously do not have the intel regarding practice and what's that been looking like. And also, I think Brian just got to campus, just started working out with the team, so it will definitely be fascinating to see, though.
Oh, so he wasn't able to go through spring?
No, because at Northwestern, the transfers are really not there in the spring. It's very complicated with the admissions process and everything like that. So I believe he and the incoming freshman just started working out.
Interesting. Yeah, certainly something that we will monitor there. The Wildcats did lose Evan Hull. They lose Malik Washington. They lose Danny Navarro. Of those skill guys who they lost, it's one running back and 2 receivers. Who will be the toughest to replace, and who are some guys perhaps who you think might step up and fill the void?
I think it's unquestionably going to be Hull. I mean, he, as you said, was a running back, but I think he really was the entire offense, if you could put it that way, for Northwestern, and really the last
71 targets.
Yeah.
That's nuts for a back. I mean,
But yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that number just speaks to the fact that he was truly dynamic whenever the ball was in his hands for Northwestern. And with a lack of consistent receiver production over the last few years, Northwestern consistently relied on Hole out of the backfield, on screens, on wheel routes, things like that. And I think that is going to be incredibly tough to replace. Looking at the running back position, you do have Cam Porter, who was fantastic in 2020, suffered an ACL tear before 2021. Last year didn't really look exactly like himself, kind of had a bit of a work in progress season, I would say, where had to ramp up activity and maybe toward the end of the year seemed to be getting a little bit of the juice back. But I would still say there are some questions with Porter. You could see Anthony Trey Tyus the third, I'd be in for a bigger season. I mean, he's kind of been a backup for Northwestern his first two seasons, but he has good balance and also has good receiving prowess too. So I think Tyus might be a guy that could step into a bigger role this year. But I really do think it's going to be a running back by committee situation for Northwestern.
Offensive line, I don't know if I'm wrong to be scared here. They lose Peter Skronsky, who was basically every single person had him as a first team All-American, but they also lose Charlie Schmidt, who played almost 900 snaps. They lose Ethan, I can't even pronounce his last name.
Wiedeker.
Okay, there we go. I mean, that's 800 snaps. You lose Piosi, who's like 700. That's a ton to lose. Not that this unit was good other than Skronsky, but the number of snaps they played suggests maybe the backups weren't serious threats to take their positions, because usually, if you have questionable guys, you rotate somebody in. Is this an area of concern for this team?
I think it definitely is, and I don't think you're wrong to be scared on the outside just looking at this offensive line. I think, as you mentioned, having three pretty significant losses on the offensive line, and it sounds like Northwestern is planning to reshuffle some guys. Josh Preeb, coming back from injury, might play tackle this year instead of guard. But yeah, I think it's going to be maybe two returning starters for Northwestern and a right tackle. Last year was Caleb Tiernan, who was a very highly touted recruit, but kind of struggled a little bit as a sophomore, just out there on an island against some of the Big Ten's best edge rushers. So Tiernan was kind of a question mark last year. We'll see how Preeb does a tackle this year. But Northwestern did not do a ton in the transfer portal to really alleviate the concerns that offensive line, especially interior offensive line, is very unknown at this moment. I mean, center in particular, Schmidt, as you said, held the position down at the very least. And while Northwestern's offensive line never really gelled much beside that Nebraska game out in Ireland, it felt like, at least you kind of knew who the starters were going to be, and you could pencil that in. And a guy like Wiedeker brought that veteran experience, could play tackle, could play guard. Right now, we don't really know what that looks like for this team. So, yeah, I think it's a very valid area of concern for Northwestern.
Defensively, this has kind of been the hallmark of Pat Fitzgerald teams. Last year, it did slip a little bit, 77th in the country. After, I know my friend Connolly had him second in the country in 2020. Again, caveat emptor with the COVID year. But this defensive line, I'm not sure what to make of it. The one thing I've noticed, just on something I track, is the players that schools are going after in the transfer portal. Are they winning them? And if they're losing those battles, who are they losing them to? And the number of offers Northwestern threw out at defensive tackle kind of scared me a little bit. I'm a little sketch on what this is going to look like. And they also lose an NFL draft pick at defensive end. Can this unit kind of hold serve? I assume it won't be better than last year, but can it not collapse?
I think only time will tell on that as the water starts to creep in to the dam a little bit. But yeah, I think defensive tackle in particular it's very fascinating. You brought that up because David Braun, the new defensive coordinator, when we were talking to him in the spring, basically implied that Northwestern did not have nearly enough players at defensive tackle. And that was an issue stemming all the way from recruiting in the past and how it was done under Jim O'Neill, the prior defensive coordinator. But yeah, Northwestern did get a few transfers that had some success at lower level schools, like Richie Haggerty from Southern Illinois should slot in kind of as a defensive edge rusher for Northwestern. But defensive tackle, again, very much, I would say unknown, similar to the offensive line. And you have someone like Najee Story, who played a little bit last year, pretty big body in the interior. But Northwestern has two new defensive tackles in Matthew Lawson from Fresno State and also a player from Bethune-Cookman. But we'll see whether or not he can see the field. But defensively, again, it's not just the loss of Adetomo Adebare too. It's guys like Cam Mitchell, AJ Hampton. The linebacking unit should be pretty consistent, I would say, but very good against the run, but definitely struggled in terms of range and in terms of coverage. So I think what's going to be really fascinating is going to be how Braun decides to implement his coverages. It sounds like it's going to be pretty similar to what we saw under Mike under Mike Hankwitz, which Northwestern fans should be somewhat reassured by, but also what Braun does to mitigate the limited coverage skills of his linebackers, maybe bring his safety down in the box or bringing the slot closer to the line of scrimmage could help against the run. But yeah, as you mentioned, this unit was really just kind of embarrassed the last 2 years under O'Neill. It just did not look very coordinated, did not look ready to stop games. I mean, they let quarterbacks like Spencer Petras and Graham Mertz just look unstoppable against them. And that's a pretty strong indictment of a unit's preparation and ability to be cohesive on the field. And Northwestern was not that at all. And in many cases, the defense was so bad, it did not even let them compete in games.
Yeah, listeners of the show will recall just kind of how repeatedly disgusted I am with Iowa's offense. But on Locks Pod on Thursday, I did bet Northwestern team total or Iowa team total over against Northwestern, in part because I'm not really sure how many people pay attention to injuries at some of these non-conference contenders within the Power Five. But you mentioned the loss of Mitchell and Hampton from the roster. Like Hampton was hurt a good bit last year. Obviously, Mitchell played pretty well. I thought. Who are the guys you would expect to maybe contend and step up to take those two spots?
I think looking at outside corner, you have a guy like Rod Hurd II, who has been pretty impressive for Northwestern, but kind of been a do-it-all cornerback, played inside, played outside. So I'm kind of expecting him to take more of that prototypical jump outside, just given his experience at true corner for Northwestern. But a guy like Garnett Hollis Jr. saw the field last year in light of the injury to Hampton, as you mentioned, and Mitchell was injured for a few games too. So Garnett Hollis Jr. could be one of those guys. Darren Johnson a little bit, kind of struggled a tad, but I think those are some of the names at cornerback to watch. And then Devin Turner as well, very versatile first year to Northwestern last year. Could play safety, could play corner. So if you're looking at a positive for this Northwestern roster, I do think there is a lot of versatility in the back end with guys like Hurd, with guys like Turner, with guys like Jeremiah Lewis, who decided to come back, the transfer from Duke. So I think Northwestern has players that can do a lot of things and have multifaceted skill sets, and how Braun decides to deploy them will be pretty telling this year.
We would have to involve cloning, but if we were able to do so to create the matchup, and you could have players on both squads, would this year's team beat the 2022 team? And if so, how confident are you in that estimation?
I think based on pure talent alone, 2022 is better because of, again, the 4 draft picks that you mentioned, Northwestern's most since 1985. And there's just nobody of the caliber of Peter Skoronski or really Adetomo Adebawore on this year's upcoming roster, it seems. But I do think 2022's team was a little unlucky. It felt like Pat Fitzgerald's messaging wasn't necessarily problematic, just kind of as he put it. The team looked really good in practice and did not execute, quote unquote, in the arena. So I feel like based on positive regression or a little bit of better luck, maybe the ball bounces a little differently. Maybe 2023, you can expect things to go a little bit better. But I would say based on, again, just the actual skill, at least on the surface of the roster this year, I would say it's probably a little worse.
Now, kicking was also a huge issue last year. And for a team like Northwestern that doesn't score a whole lot of touchdowns and has drives stall out in the red zone pretty frequently, it's important that they have at least passable kicking. And they had one of the worst kicking in terms of the ability to actually hit long field goals. They basically didn't try any, right? And they were just kind of okay from short range. They lose at Adam Stage. Is Jack Olson projected to be the guy here, or have they brought somebody in that I'm not aware of?
It does seem like Olson is going to be the guy. He was a pretty highly touted transfer from Michigan State, but I think his tenure at Northwestern hasn't gone as expected either. And that's also been kind of a familiar refrain for some of the high-profile recruits that Northwestern has brought in, whether they're 4-star prospects, whether they're guys like Hunter Johnson, Ryan Helinski at quarterback. But Olson was, I believe, injured most of last year. I think he only attempted 1 kick. So I think it's expected that he will be the guy this year. Northwestern does add a walk-on kicker, but I doubt he would really strongly compete with Olson. So, yeah, it's going to be intriguing to see if Olson can finally kind of put all of his talent together after coming over from East Lansing this year.
The question we always ask, other than quarterback, where's the spot where the backups are just probably, not that they suck necessarily, but like are not ready to be passable players this year, and thus that you really need the starters to stay healthy at blank?
Oh, man, I think excuse me. I think for Northwestern, You could say offensive line, defensive line. I think there's not a lot of really great depth at both of those positions. And I think, again, as we were talking about with the offensive line, we don't even really know a clear picture of what the starters will look like. And that's in part because the backups and really the players who are in the mix to start have not seen the field much. Guys like Dom D'Antonio, Jackson Carcello, they've been kind of on the bench their first 2-3 years at Northwestern, and now are probably going to have to make that jump. Defensive line, kind of a similar story. Lots of young players and guys that just really flat out do not have experience to play in Big Ten games. I think will they may have to be counted on if the starting units do not produce or somebody gets healthy. But in an ideal world for Northwestern, I feel like you have 5 starters in the offensive line, maybe 4 on the defensive line that you trust at least a little bit, and just kind of see what happens. But if one of those players like Sean McLaughlin on the defensive line, probably the most trusted vet in that room, if he goes down, it's going to be pretty concerning for Northwestern.
Bradley, really appreciate the time. Everybody, Bradley_Locker. Dude, really enjoyed this.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me again. And I always love all your work, and really great to be with you.
Thanks, man.